Hello and welcome. In the world of good clinical laboratory practice, some of the most important work actually happens long before a single sample ever hits the lab bench. So today we're going to dive deep into the bedrock of any successful clinical trial analysis, the contracts and agreements that map out every single relationship and responsibility.
All right, so here's what we've got on tap. We're going to follow the journey of a lab we're calling Apex Labs to really see how these principles play out in the real world. We'll kick things off with their first agreement with a sponsor. Then we'll get into the tricky business of subcontractors, see how they handle changes midstream, and we'll wrap it all up with a really practical checklist you can take back to your own work.
So, let's set the scene. Imagine this. Apex Labs is a top-notch facility, and they've just landed the analytical work for a huge new clinical trial. You can picture it, right? The team's all set, the equipment is perfectly calibrated, and the sponsor is chomping at the bit to get started.
But this brings up a really important question. With everything ready to go, where does the real work, the GCLP compliant work, actually kick off? Is it the moment that first sample arrives? Or maybe when the first assay is run?
While the answer couldn't be clearer, according to the core principles of GCLP, absolutely no trial-related work can even start until all the contracts and agreements are signed, sealed, and delivered. And look, this isn't just a nice-to-have or a best practice. This is an absolute, non-negotiable requirement for compliance.
So, the very first step for Apex Labs is to make their relationship with the trial sponsor official. And to do that, we have to get crystal clear on who they're dealing with. The sponsor isn't just the one with the checkbook. They're the ones taking responsibility for the initiation and the management of the entire trial. And it's that total responsibility that makes the contract so incredibly vital.
Okay, so let's dig into how Apex Labs actually puts together this primary agreement. This document is going to become the single source of truth for their entire role in this trial.
So the very first thing Apex Labs has to figure out is what type of agreement they need. If they're a separate company, say a contract research lab, they're going to need a formal, legally binding contract. But if they were a lab inside the sponsor's own organization, then an internal service level agreement, or an SLA, would be the right tool. At the end of the day, they both do the same job: spell out all the roles, responsibilities, and how everyone's going to communicate.
Now, it doesn't matter what kind of document you're using, there are some core principles that are totally non-negotiable. First, the agreement can never, ever contradict the clinical protocol. It also has to follow all the local laws. And this one is key. The hierarchy of documents has to be crystal clear. Think about it. What happens if your big master agreement says one thing, but the specific plan for this trial says something else? You absolutely cannot have any gray area there.
All right, now let's throw a classic wrench in the works. Apex Labs is cruising along, they've got months of analysis planned out, and then they hit a snag. The protocol calls for a very specialized microbiological test that they just don't do in-house.
You'd think the obvious solution is just to outsource it, right? So can they just find a good lab and hire them to do the work? Seems easy enough, but, well, GCLP has some very specific things to say about this.
And the answer is a hard no, at least not on their own. The sponsor has to formally agree to any and all subcontracting. Apex Labs just can't make that call by themselves. This needs to be officially documented, and it might even mean they have to amend their main agreement with the sponsor. It's that serious.
And here's the part you absolutely cannot forget. Even with the sponsor's blessing, the responsibility doesn't just disappear. Apex Labs is still 100% on the hook for the quality and the integrity of all the data that comes out of that subcontractor. From a regulator's point of view, it's as if Apex did the work themselves.
So, to handle that huge responsibility, Apex has a rock-solid three-step process they follow. First, they get that sponsor approval in writing. Next, they do a deep dive to assess the other lab's competence and compliance. And only when that's all done do they sign a formal contract between the two labs. And all of this has to happen before a single sample gets touched.
Now, that second step, assessing their competence, is absolutely crucial. I mean, Apex can't just take their word for it, right? They have to prove it. So they might do an on-site audit, they'll dig into the GCP training records of the key people, and they'll use technical questionnaires to verify everything. The goal here is to be totally confident that the quality of the work will be just as good as their own, if not better.
Okay, so let's jump back into our story. Months go by, the trial is running like a well-oiled machine, and then, ping, an email lands from the sponsor. There's been an amendment to the clinical protocol, and it's going to change some of the testing they need to do.
And this is exactly why GCLP is so big on having a formal written process for the entire contract lifecycle. So Apex Labs isn't scrambling. They have a procedure that tells them exactly what to do when a revision is needed. This whole system makes sure that your contracts aren't just documents you sign and then file away to gather dust.
So this really paints the picture of the contract's entire life, doesn't it? It's not a one-and-done deal. It gets drafted and agreed upon before anything starts. Then it's reviewed on a schedule to make sure it's still relevant. It gets revised whenever something big changes, like that protocol amendment. And finally, when the trial is over, it's archived securely as a vital record.
So, we've followed Apex Labs through the whole journey, right? Their setup, the challenges they faced, how they managed change. Now let's boil all of that down into a practical checklist you can actually use to take a look at your own processes. All right, let's recap the big takeaways here. First, the foundational stuff. Get those agreements in place before you start any work and make sure they never clash with the protocol. When you bring in third parties, you've got to remember 2 golden rules. Get the sponsor's approval first, and never forget that you are still fully responsible for their work. And finally, and this is huge, treat your contracts like living, breathing documents. Have a written process for their entire life cycle and review them regularly to keep them current.
And that really brings us to the final, crucial question. Because think about it, a well-managed contract, it's your shield. It's an asset that provides clarity and proves compliance. But a poorly managed one, that's a ticking time bomb, just waiting for an auditor to find it. So the question I want to leave you with is this. Take a hard look at your own agreements. Are they an asset or are they an audit risk? Thank you for your time.